Up here to talk about this report after we receive a presentation on it, and then there will be a chance for you to ask questions. We want to keep this as interactive as possible during the Q&A session. I could certainly stand up here and ask a bunch of questions, but we'd really like to hear from all of you what sort of questions you might have after you hear about the report and you hear from our panelists. First, to present the report, we have Ralph Martiri. He's Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. In February 2011, he was appointed to serve on the U.S. Department of Education Equity and Excellence Commission. He is a distinguished lecturer on public policy for Roosevelt University and has taught fiscal policy seminars for various universities and the International Fulbright Scholar Program. We also have with us Danielle Stanley. She's a research associate with the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Her work focuses primarily on combating structural racism. Before coming to the CTBA, she was a legislative assistant to Democratic State Senator Dan Katowski of Park Ridge, and she worked for the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation as a liaison. So I'll turn things over to them to present the findings from their study.
Good morning. So, normally when the center comes up to talk about education, about 9 times out of 10, we're talking about K-12, and we're talking about how poorly funded K-12 is across the state. But what's been bothering us at the organization is we've been watching the funding and the commitment to higher education at the state level, and it is even worse. And it just seems to not get any attention. So we decided to do a study on it for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons is the growing importance of higher education to the economy in general and to a worker's perspective specifically. In fact, who heard Governor Rauner's State of the State address? Did anyone listen to that? He made a big deal about education, and in particular higher education, right? And he's saying how we wanted to expand the footprint of a couple of our major research facilities. It's hard to imagine how one can expand the footprint of our higher educational institutions when funding for them is down by some 64% from 2015 levels. I hear the commitment, and yet I don't see the dollars. And so what we wanted to do is provide sort of the context of the dollars, put them in context of the economy, and what our state has been doing over time. So for a while, there's been growing correlations between educational attainment and economic viability. Really the only group of workers in all of America since 1980 that have seen their incomes increase at a rate greater than inflation, so real growth in purchasing power, have a college degree. Everybody else is earning less than what they did then. We also know that there's a direct correlation between your unemployment rate and educational attainment. And as this slide shows, right, the higher your level of educational attainment, the lower your unemployment rate, I guess, except for art history majors, and no one's going to really help them. And I have 2 sisters who are in the arts, and so I really, really enjoy saying that. But I think, we have these conversations at the state level about what we ought to be doing to grow our economy, what policy decisions we should make, and it's really clear. There's only 2 policy decisions available to lawmakers at the state level that have a statistically meaningful correlation to making a state's economy more competitive, grow faster, have higher growth in median wage, higher growth in jobs, all those things. Only 2. How well that state invests in infrastructure and how well it invests in education. And education meaning pre-K through 20. So let's talk about some of the statistics here because I think it's really important. The BLS found the unemployment rate for dropouts is 2.8 times greater than those with a 4-year degree, okay? From 1979 to 2012, states with the greatest number of college grads had the greatest growth in productivity, and states with the best high school and college completion rates had the highest per capita income. It's just the data. And you're seeing these correlations are incredibly strong across the board. And what's interesting is they're becoming more and more important over time. That is, educational attainment is really far more important today than it was even in 1979. So here you see the wage differential between someone that has a high school degree and a college degree in 1979 and a high school degree and advanced degree. 23% premium for the college grad in 79, 32% premium for the professional grad. It's doubled by 2011. Doubled. I mean, if that doesn't drive home the importance of higher education and making higher education accessible, right? I mean, it's a really important thing. I don't know if any of you saw that recent study that came out of a couple of researchers, one from Stanford, one from Brown University. I mean, it's not only important in general, it's really important if you're concerned about people from a lower income background moving up to self-sufficiency and up the income ladder. In fact, those community colleges and those universities that really focus on bringing in low-income population students have played a tremendous role in helping those kids move up the income ladder, right? So this investment is one that's not just for your most premier universities, et cetera, et cetera. If you really want to be making sound policy decisions at the state level that are related to your economic growth, you need to be looking at your higher education system writ large, community colleges all the way up to the university system, and you really need to be making sure you're investing in them appropriately, and that is a great way to grow your economy, and the data are compelling here. So, how has Illinois been investing in its higher education system? I would suggest not really so well. So the Illinois Board of Higher Education, by statute, is required every year to make a recommendation to both the governor and the General Assembly about what level of funding is appropriate for higher ed that year. And a number of factors go into play. This shows you that since 2008 forward, the state has never once funded the recommendation made by the Illinois Board of Higher Education. Never once. Actual funding levels have always been consistently lower than what the Board of Education indicates is appropriate under the circumstances. Okay, there's one God, and we didn't come out so good there at the state level. And I thought maybe we ought to look at long-term investment in services. Because the general fund, which is where higher education gets funded, really has responsibility for only 4 core service areas writ large over time. 9 out of 10 dollars through our general fund have consistently been invested in education, and that is early childhood on through higher ed, healthcare, social services, and public safety. That's it. That's where 9 out of 10 dollars get spent. So we thought it'd be interesting to look at how appropriations in 2015 is a magic year in Illinois. It's the last year we actually had a general fund budget. How those appropriations in 2015 compared to 2000 after adjusting for inflation. But why don't you look here? You see healthcare was down by 22%. In fact, everything's down. Pre-K, down 13%. Look at the hit to higher ed. In 2015, after adjusting for inflation, higher education was receiving in real terms 41% less than what it got in 2000. But to see how stark the cut was to higher ed, look at those numbers again. Higher education is the only of the core service areas, the only one that was receiving less in nominal dollars in 2015 than it had in 2000. Not adjusted. I mean, backing away from investing in higher education couldn't be made more clear about the pattern over time here. So not only hasn't the state sort of risen to the plate and put into higher ed what the Illinois Board of Higher Education suggested was appropriate, we've disinvested from earlier amounts that we put into higher education funding. Now, what happened in 2016? 2016, we never got a final general fund budget for the state of Illinois. Legislators did pass a budget on early childhood, K-12, and higher ed. They passed some other smaller appropriations, some for child care for single working parents, et cetera, et cetera. But literally 2/3 of the funding that happened through the general fund in 2016 came by a court order or consent decree. This is a little step off of the higher ed piece, but think about that. I mean, no legislator voted on 2/3 of that spending. Governor didn't sign it into law or veto it or line item veto it. Never went through a public budgeting process. 2/3 of the spending on core services was never subject to a public vote or hearing. That is probably not the most transparent or accountable way to do your budgeting process. I'm just going to throw that out there as a wild stab. Well, let's see what we did with higher ed. I mean, we did, in fact, pass budgets. These were voted into law by the General Assembly, signed by the governor. Early childhood got a nice little bump, 7%. K-12, modest cut, 1%. Then look what we did to higher ed. 67% cut, 67% from prior year. And the prior year, 2015, as you now know, was no bonanza, right? This wasn't the halcyon days of higher education funding. Far from it. We had been disinvesting for 15 consecutive years in higher education. We were putting less into it in 2015 in nominal dollars than we did in 2000. And then we made the policy decision to whack it by 67% on a year-to-year basis. That's astounding. It also makes us kind of an outlier as a state. So 37 states actually increased their higher ed funding from fiscal 2015 through 2016. Illinois is one of only 4 states in America that cut higher ed funding in both fiscal 2015 and 2016 from the prior year level, so woohoo, bottom 4. And one of only 9 states in America that cut higher ed funding by 30% or more since the Great Recession ended. So we are now a national outlier compared to the rest of the country in our approach to investing in higher education, despite all the data which show how important higher education is, both to your state's overall economy and to a worker and individual's perception or role in the modern economy, right? And we're disinvesting. So, what happened in 2017? Well, we still don't have a budget for this year either. It'll be interesting to see what the governor says in his budget address tomorrow. That's coming up tomorrow. And hopefully he'll shed some light on where we're going to go. Where we went wasn't great. So we did increase higher ed approach to $700 million, and then another $26 million went to higher ed approach through some court order consent decree kind of stuff. So higher ed got $726 million, a minor bump from where it was in 2016. But let's look at it over time. Compared to 2000 in nominal dollars, just in nominal dollars, it was down quite a bit, by over $1 billion, right? But then you adjust for inflation and take a real perspective. Our current funding level for higher education is almost 79% lower than it was in 2000. 79%. I don't have a comment to describe it from either a good government standpoint or an economic standpoint or a smart utilization of taxpayer resources. There's no way to justify this. There just is no way to justify this. And it's had consequences, of course. And Danielle, who was the principal researcher, by the way, on this report and really put all this data together, is going to dig down on some of the details of what it's meant for things like tuition, blushing, things like that. But just common sense tells you, right? Is this helping in any way universities, community colleges to serve the students that walk through the door? Does it encourage students to walk through the door? What's it do to tuition? What's it do to local economies? You know, there's a multiplier effect. One of the best things to use when you're looking at the impact of fiscal decisions. And so at the state level, when we cut spending on higher ed, we know there's a multiplier. And in a local community, a smaller community, let's say a Macomb as opposed to Chicago. Chicago has so many services, businesses, et cetera, in the area that actually the multiplier is higher there because you're not going to get as much leakage of economic activity. But even in smaller communities, for every dollar cut on higher ed spending, the impact on the local economy is a loss of $1.36 of economic activity. That is harmful to private sector economies at the local level, right? So it just, when you start looking at a big picture, you start putting everything together, you look at the importance of higher education to the economy in general, it just cannot be justified. Now, This is our change in per student funding for higher education in the 15 largest states. The second worst change over the sequence, this is from the end of the Great Recession, is where? Illinois. And we just barely nosed out Arizona. Woohoo, I'm proud of that. So what's the prognosis for the future? Not good. So when CTBA, and we're sort of an odd duck, right? The center is not technically nonpartisan, we are technically bipartisan. So that means my board of directors has Democrats and Republicans on it who don't really like or trust each other very much. And that's fantastic for us at the staff level, because it allows us to focus on best practices and data. We don't really care about ideological underpinnings of anything, right? We look for what are the demographically driven needs, what are the best practices to meet those needs, what are the costs of funding those best practices, and how best do you raise the revenue to fund those practices sustainably over time. Crazy way to approach public policy, I know, but we say, leave your ideological worldview at the door. So for that reason, we don't like to do modeling, because anyone here who's done modeling knows that your assumptions can very much dictate your outcomes. And we don't want to be accused of dictating outcomes. However, when you project forward and you try to look at how revenue systems are going to perform over time compared to you do have to do a projection. So this is our structural deficit projection. This is the only modeling in this presentation. You should know whenever we do something like this, we have it peer reviewed. This was peer reviewed by 4 different PhD economists at different universities across the state. In fact, you might know a couple. Jim Nolan and Fred Gertz had a hand in peer reviewing this. I'm sure many of you know those 2 gentlemen. As well as the head of state and local tax at the GAO in Washington, D.C. And they blessed the model as a fair and accurate model. We've been using this model about 11 years now, 12 years at CTBA. And it actually has projected the state's deficit within 1%, except those years when they changed law. So what are our assumptions? And they're the same thing the Congressional Budget Office uses as assumptions. No change in law, historic rates of inflation, historic rates of population change, historic rates of economic growth. That's it, right? So, one other assumption, which is important for Illinois. We assume you start with a balanced budget, which we don't have a balanced budget, right? But if you did, if our revenues were equal to our expenditures, would our current law on revenue be able to support our current level of expenditures plus cover our current debt load over time? So you see the bluish, blackish bar at the top, that's the cost bar going forward from 2015. The red bar is the revenue line. And the gap between sort of the growth in your service cost and your debt cost and your revenue is the structural imbalance. And that's how much your deficit will grow year-to-year basis if we were starting from a balanced budget, et cetera. We weren't. We were starting from an accumulated deficit of $5.97 billion. So the first thing that structural deficit model tells you is that there's really not a lot of high-end prospects for the state to reverse its disinvestment in the higher education system unless we change tax policy. I mean, it's just sort of true. Tax policy doesn't work in the modern economy, and our state tax policy, as we've designed it, we need to fix it. But I want to show you how pernicious this structural imbalance is and how revenue-driven the problem is by walking through this deficit model. So I'm gonna look down here because I have these microphones. I don't want to walk away from the microphones. I normally am pointing up there, but look at the very first column in Romanet 1, $30.3 billion. That's the projection of revenue for 2016. Now, that's what we had. Then in 2016, out of that revenue, we had to pay $12 billion in hard costs. Those are things the state had to pay by law, no discretion, no option, right? The 3 of them are really the debt service to third parties, you have to pay that by law, the continuing appropriation for the pension payment, which is primarily debt service again, and then 2 other big statutory transfers out. One is for Medicaid, where we are required to put some money in trust funds under the federal financing arrangement we have for Medicaid, and then the other is the local government distributive fund, where the state shares its income tax revenue with local governments. So you take that $12 billion off the top, that leaves $18 billion in revenue. So that would be the far column over here. Far. So now revenue after hard costs, you have to take out that accumulated deficit. Why? What's it mean? Well, the deficit that was left over from 2015 are just unpaid bills. They have to be paid by law before the end of 2016. So that 2015 accumulated deficit becomes a charge on current revenue in 2016. That's how this deficit thing works. So you take that out, that leaves $12.3 billion. After all the court orders, consent decrees, and everything else, they're going to spend about $21.7 billion. But they only had $12.3 billion in revenue left. Meaning, despite the fact that they actually cut spending on services by $2 billion year to year, 2015 to 2016, the deficit grew from 5.9 to 9.4 billion. It grew that much because of the significant decline in revenue that the state faced from the phase down of the temporary tax increase. You know, a lot of people try to criticize the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability because we're always talking about tax policy as something that has to be on the table and fixed. There's two reasons why we do that. Number one, it's really the cause of our problems. It is. And number two, no one else seems to want to talk about it. So would I like to go on the stump and say things like, well, if we just got more efficient in the blah, blah, blah program, we could save $20 million. I'm sure I would love to say that. I'm sure I could find that $20 million. We got a $9 billion problem. The $9 billion problem won't go away without tax reform. We won't fund higher education or K-12 without tax reform. We won't get out of our pension debt without tax reform. And when I say tax reform, I do mean tax increases. I don't want to be subtle here. Right? We need to increase the income tax rate. We need to expand the sales tax base. We probably have to tax some retirement income. We have to do those things. If we did those things, in fact, if we raised about $7.5 billion in total revenue, sounds like a lot of money, right? But if we raised that, over time we could not only eliminate our structural imbalance, we could fund K-12 appropriately. That is what the evidence indicates it needs to provide every child a meaningful opportunity to learn when they walk through his or her neighborhood school, as well as reinvest in higher ed and reinvest in social services. So we could really solve a lot of problems. Now, when I say it's not that big of a deal, $7.5 billion is about 1% of our state's economy. We have a $750 billion economy. So a collective tax increase through those different sources that takes only 1% of the economic activity in the state of Illinois is frankly too small to be measured. And that's what's standing in the way of our state honestly solving our problems. So I'm not going to apologize for focusing on tax policy. I would love to be able to focus on some other things. Can't, because tax policy is the driver. Now, Danielle is going to come up here, and like I said, she was the primary researcher on this report. She really did all this work and walk through some of the impacts of this disinvestment in higher education through universities and communities across the state. Danielle?
Good morning, everybody, and happy Valentine's Day. Thank you for spending your morning with us. Hopefully it's more romantic in the evening. So the first slide I would like to show you all is a comparison of fiscal year 2017 to fiscal year 2015. Fiscal year 2017 was a stopgap budget. And as you can see, University of Illinois received the largest cut in nominal dollars, which is $297 million, while Chicago State University, which normally receives the lowest amount of appropriations from the past 10 fiscal years, received the largest percentage cut by 65.3%. Western Illinois University was cut by 39%, and then $20 million in nominal dollars as well. So what does that mean as far as these cuts from a nominal and a percentage-wise? Newspapers have been reporting, for instance, that Illinois State University has cut their instructional budget by $1 million, which means crowded classrooms, less classes offered in a semester, and Illinois State University also increased their tuition by 3% for undergraduates. Chicago State University laid off 40% of their workforce on non-faculty positions. And so that means students who see day-to-day non-faculty positions like admission counselors, people who cook in the cafeteria, things of that nature, maintenance. But Chicago State University is also was thinking about closing their doors this past spring because they were the lack of appropriations. But recently, Chicago Tribune reported that Chicago State University is looking to expand a second campus. So despite them having these major budget cuts and laying off 40% of their workforce, they are looking to build another campus on the west side of Chicago. So I'm looking to follow that story to see how they're going to come up with that money, because the president of Chicago State University has said that it will be mostly donations, their own, it won't be state appropriation dollars. So I'll like to see how that's going to manifest. Western Illinois University laid off 145 non-faculty positions, as well as eliminated academic programs such as women's studies, philosophy, African American studies. And so that's interesting because during this time we have a Trump administration and they're talking about social justice and things of that nature, and we want to promote critical thinking. These programs have been cut. And it's not only because of the budget impasse, it's also because these programs have been low enrollment in the past as well. University of Illinois eliminated 484 non-instructional staff positions. So that includes U of I Champaign, University of Illinois at Chicago, as well as University of Illinois at Springfield. And Eastern Illinois University laid off 177 civil service employees, as well as instituted furlough days. So all these universities at the Illinois level have been forced to make controversial decisions that impact the capacity, which ultimately serves their students. This slide is a 2014 profile of university dependence on state funding. Certain universities can rely on international tuition as a form of revenue, like the University of Illinois, and have a large endowment, like the University of Illinois, that has $26,000 per student. So even though the state has been cutting their budget past fiscal years, U of I, for one example, have the capacity to offer scholarships for their students so they can continue to attend their colleges. But the Governor State University, that has 0% at the time of 2014, so they don't receive any international students. It's like a very small decimal point, and have a low endowment as well. So you can see those comparisons as well. This slide is the tuition growth at national universities from 1990 to 2015. And as you can see, it's cheaper to go to a public in-state university. However, in Illinois, the Illinois universities were forced to increase their tuition by 50 to 100% because the state has historically disinvested in their public universities. Between 1980 to 2015, a University of Illinois had a cut of 40% over that time period. And so this slide just shows you the comparison from private institutions, public out-of-state tuition, and public in-state tuition, and how Illinois has increased their tuition by 50%, which means it's outstripping households' income. So meaning most families in Illinois can't even send their children to colleges. And if they are, the students are forced to take out student loans. And this is the breakdown. This slide is really geared towards students when they're trying to decide which college they want to go to in Illinois, to see the tuition by in-state or out-of-state. As you can see, University of Illinois has a tuition rate of $31,000 for their undergraduate students and $46,000 for out-of-state tuition. So as you can see, I talked earlier about how tuition has increased by 50 to 100% over time. So that leads students depending on student loans. So right here is the slide from 1989 to 2013, how there's an increase regardless of race, that more families are taking out student loans. However, it's more pronounced in African American households, which is 41.8% in 2013. The Urban Institute has reported that the reason why African Americans do take out more loans compared to their white and Hispanic peers is because due to past discrimination in the employment sector in their parents' generation. That means they did not accumulate wealth over time. So their parents did not have a college savings plan for their child, so therefore they don't have money to send their child to school or have a nest egg for them compared to white households. And because student loans, let me go back. And student loans right now is a national crisis. It's $1.3 trillion of loans that's been taken out in the United States. So it's a huge problem that needs to be addressed, whether at the state level, if we can get more MAP funding, more scholarship offers, but it is a problem that's impacting all households, all races, and so it's just a national crisis. And that impacts enrollment. So 10 out of the 13 public universities did suffer a decrease in enrollment. Chicago State University has a decline of 24% from 2015 to 2016. For their freshman class, there was only 89 students enrolled this year. So even though they're thinking about expanding a campus to the west side of Chicago, they have a low enrollment in their current campus, which is very detrimental. And it's a new great migration. 16,000 students in Illinois have left to go to school outside of the state of Illinois, while only 2,000 students came to Illinois to attend colleges. So we're losing that tax base, that revenue, because oftentimes when students attend a college in that state, they tend to work there, get their first job, contribute to the tax base. So we're losing additional revenue because universities are forced to raise tuition because the state has disinvested historically. So it's a multiplier effect, as we can see roll out and play and see today how this is impacting enrollment. Let's talk about the monetary award program, which helps low-income students for grant assistance that does not have to be paid back compared to student loans. From fiscal year to fiscal year 2015, it was a 12% decline, which served 128,000 students were able to receive MAPs during the academic year. However, for academic year 2016, 2017, 160,000 students that were eligible was declined from MAP grants. And so far, since there is no budget, there has been any MAPs appropriated for academic year 2016, 2017, which means some universities are giving out grants out of their own reserves, but other institutions like Illinois Institute of Technology is just giving out a loan that needs to be repaid back in a timely manner. And finally, this is a 2015 unemployment rate by race at education level. As Rich pointed out, that I am a research associate focused on combating structural racism. So I just wanted to just show you that despite the higher education attainment, the less likely you're going to be unemployed, it still shows that African Americans is the largest college educated group that has an unemployment rate that's similar to the national unemployment rate, which is 5.3%. And so there's things that need to be addressed despite just, receiving an education and you'll be able to get a job. There are still some things, as far as discriminatory policies, that needs to be addressed. And so now we're going to do the panel discussion. Rich?